Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Joe here from East Macostan,
Hello and greetings.
and we've got a very short chapter to
More,
discuss.
more like a blurb.
Yeah, I know. Well, this is actually 4 pages in the paperback edition of the Plantagenets, the Kings Who Made England. This is called Hunt for an Heir, and the thing is, Dan Jones starts this blurb with Henri le Premier was the man against whom no one could prevail except God himself, according to at least a Brut Chronicle. And it seems like Henri's rule was a massive success at every turn. He was the 4th son of Guillaume le Conquérant. He had a long, very prosperous reign of 35 years, and he didn't much interest himself in too much war. But he did, however, show some ruthlessness when he reunited the English and Norman crowns. He was to defeat his elder brother Robert Curthose at the Battle of Tinchebray in 1106, and he would seize control of Normandy, and thereafter he kept Robert prisoner. Robert, though, became, I think, something of a man of letters during this time because he needed a coping mechanism. And Robert was not happy about his imprisonment and was left bitter and broken because his younger brother usurped him when rightfully he should have been at the front of the line for both territories. And he only got Normandy. Guillaume Rufus got Angleterre. And Henri, after he slew Guillaume, was to beat Robert in battle and take Normandy. Now, Henri is an interesting figure. Very good monarch, very good father, but he murdered his brother. Like, obviously he was a very complicated figure and man. In a way, he was a lot more complex a human being than any currently alive, for the most part. And you look at... there's something I heard recently. Men and women of 1,000 years ago were far more fleshed out, far more developed people than we are today. And that there's something of a infantilizing element to a lot of modern-day technology like TikTok, YouTube, and whatnot. And our video games and whatnot. And we deliberately infantilize ourselves and do not deepen the character, our overall character. And people just throw themselves into work, basically living at, let's say, the factory. The factory being like an example of living at work, and not really doing anything that deepens your personal character, like going fishing or, oh, well, I'm not really into reading philosophy. I'll still read it just to develop my philosophical understanding of the world. Or, oh, well, I'm not really into history, but I'll at least learn the history of my country. You know, like that. Like, that requires you deepen your character. But we don't really do that as much in the modern day. And it's the whole problem of modernity. Henri was a better and more balanced individual than we are today, even though, you know, he did kinslaying. At least that's an argument I've heard recently regarding men and women of back then. And it's hard to disagree. And it is something worth pondering about, I think. That said, Henri used his time as king very well. He developed, well, he kind of tried to apply both Anglo-Saxon and Normand loi, like the loi de Normandie, in the individual territories, and also start to import them into each other and fuse them together a little. Now, in Normandy, there would be a lot of time spent after Philippe Auguste reversing this fact and turning Normandy more towards a French legal system and tradition. And England was to go in a very different direction, as is known, towards their common law. But it's not hard to imagine Normandy maybe, had they stayed together, becoming a common law area. That being said, Robert was imprisoned until his death at Cardiff Castle in 1134. So he died a year or so before his brother.
That's a long imprisonment.
Oh yeah, from 1106 to 1134. So that's about 28 years. That's cruel. It is a very cruel thing to do to your own brother. Now, if you had released him, there would have been civil war. So many men would have died. But on the other hand, is there really a moral argument or excuse for this? Usurping your brother and then imprisoning him. It is a difficult situation. And that said, the Anglo-Normand aristocracy would be encouraged to intermingle and to have a cross-channel kind of set of territories by Henri I. And Queen Mathilde, or Queen Matilda, was the woman he chose to marry in order to bring the Normand and Saxon bloodlines together, healing, or at least attempting to heal the wounds created by the conquest. A great novel for this era is Pillars of the Earth, wherein you see that now the wounds were not healed at this time. They were not. The Anglo-Saxons were still very much the peasants, and they would continue to basically be treated in a callous manner. Or I should say maybe the Anglo-Danish people, because the Danes had already intermingled so much with the Anglo-Saxons. So, but the wounds would endure until probably, to an extent, the Edwardian period. That's a long time. And the most Anglo-Saxon area in England was the area that suffered the most under Guillaume le Conquérant, and that would be the northern part of England, which was colonized by Anglo-Saxons because a huge chunk of them was wiped out during Guillaume's reign. So, you have to basically repopulate the region, or a portion of it, near York, I believe. Go there, repopulate. But over the centuries, it became English, really. Anglo-Saxon. The trouble is, the South became the home of the noblesse française, the French nobility of England. In turn, I guess that's my theory. It's not entirely fact, but it's what I've observed from and learned from discussing with a lot of Englishmen who tell me York is the most English part of the country. Culturally, if York falls to another culture or something, that's it. It's done. You conquer York, you've conquered England. But York and everything north of it has for centuries always been trying to break off and become part of either Scotland or become its own state. It always wants to break off because it's not happy with the South. And there's a lot of history of it breaking off or trying, like I said, especially in the Scottish Wars of Independence, there was an attempt to break it off wholesale. And the Scots have long since wanted it. And arguably, from what I've talked to of people out there, I have some Yorkshire friends. They wish they had become Scottish. And I know some Scots who wish that they had managed to get their hands on the North. So it's a very weird relationship between the south of England, the north of England, and Scotland. So, very weird. Anyways, that being said, Henri would have, of course, his son Guillaume, named after uncle and grandpa, and he would grant the English barons a Charter of Liberties, which celebrated the laws of Edward the Confessor, guaranteed baronial rights, and set out some limits to royal power. And he would also clarify things by sending out royal judges into the English shires. That being said, there was... Now, he guaranteed English rights, but they're still serfs now. Before they were not. Now they are. So, on the surface, there's this Anglo-Saxon law. By reality, you got Normans in charge. There is a divide. So, and he only cemented it, even more so. So, like, if the status quo was established by Guillaume le Conquérant, Guillaume Rufus, Henri is the one clarifying it and further solidifying it in law. Now, on the other hand, he was an Anglophile, despite being Français. So, he was someone who liked his subjects. He was not like his brother and father who just saw them as people that you could crush and squeeze for money. He liked his people, though that didn't mean that he wanted to remove his heel from their throat. He wanted to keep the heel firmly on their throat, but he liked them. Better someone who likes you, I guess. Especially when you consider, let's say, today's politics where politicians don't like their people. And they just keep squeezing the boot on our throats. So, you know, like, that's the thing. At least if a politician likes you, or a ruler likes you, he'll be more statesmanly towards you, and he'll treat you with a bit more human decency. Now, after the Aetheling's death, Henri turned to Mathilde, his daughter. At the time of her brother's death, she was 18 years old. Now, she was living in Germany for a decade, since the age of 8, because she had to marry, I hope I say this right, Heinrich V. And by 1125, she was a widow. She was, however, to receive in 1126 at Christmas the oaths of fealty from the Anglo-Norman lords. And in 1128, she was married off at the age of 26 to Geoffroy d'Anjou at Le Mans, near the frontier between Anjou and Normandy, because Henri was still determined to get his Angevin match. And this was meant to end centuries of rivalry between these two sides. But this is destined to be a match which is both a match made in hell for everyone, including France and the people, and future rulers, as the Angevins are a tricky people, and they had a history of violence, although they were a very complex people. Geoffroy did not have a history of extreme violence. Fulk Cinq, his dad, not really all that much. But I'll get to my views in a little. The thing is, Geoffroy was actually known as Le Bel, the fair, which actually, the traditional term meant good looking. So he was very handsome, very famous for his good looks. He was aware, and he liked his women. He got around, much like his son later would, but where his son was later to lean slightly towards a greater deal of stoutness or fatness, Geoffroy, I don't think, did. And Mathilde did not like this or her husband at all. The two did not initially take to each other, really didn't like each other. And it took Henri basically having to come over after they separated and basically just tell them, listen, knock it off. 2 dynasties are counting on you. Knock it off. You have to get along. And basically having to play marriage counselor. And what happened was that they eventually sat down, did their duty, though they still didn't like each other. And eventually they then noticed one thing. Hey, wait a minute. Henri shortchanged on the dowry. He was supposed to give key castles so that the barons could not double-cross the couple. Henri did not want to give those castles because he feared that Geoffroy would just invade. Now, Geoffroy's argument and Mathilde's was, why would we invade when we're going to inherit it anyways? But we need the castles in case the vassals double cross us. So, logic and reason is on their side. It was more an irrational fear of a younger man, surpassing him. Henri would later surrender the castles, reluctantly. But the most notable thing is that in 1133, the new heir was born, Henri, named after his grandpa. Henri II would become one of the most famous monarchs of all times. Henri II would become, in a lot of ways, the father of the common law of England. He was to have one of the most brilliant legal and constitutional minds in all of Western history after the Roman period. And he was a brilliant military commander. He was an innovator in a lot of ways. And he had an incredible amount of energy. And unlike his sons Jean and Richard, he was not incompetent. Jean would have some ability for military affairs when he put his mind to it. Other times Jean was just too lazy to do anything right. While Richard could build better castles than Henri, but was indecisive and could not decide what was the biggest priority most of the time, and would just fumble everything up and run from pretty much, I think I've secured this. Oh, wait, I have to go secure that. Which one do I do? I'll go try to secure a third thing. Loses both of Castle 1 and 2 because he was too busy being unsure of what to do and then going for number 3. He was also cruel, ill-tempered, and just generally incompetent on foreign affairs because he had a tendency of turning allies into enemies needlessly. Henri didn't really have that flaw. So Henri II would become a man a lot like his grandfather, but also like his mother, which is both a positive and a negative. And I'll get to that. Now, at the time of the wedding, Geoffroy d'Anjou was 15. And he didn't like his bride, who was 11 years his senior. Most men probably would not be too happy about marrying a woman 11 years their senior. And they did not consummate the match at first. So, the truth of the matter is that there were also dark rumors about the Angevin. Now, you had a rumor that Fulk III Le Noir, or the Black, had once had his wife, his first wife, burnt alive after he discovered she had cheated on him. This in spite of the fact that he was a known rapist and mass murderer and just generally an unpleasant guy. And he had her burnt at the stake in her wedding dress. That's what the rumor says. Now, without doing research, I'm not sure if that's true. But if I were to look into it, I could tell you whether or not it was true or not. As for the other rumor regarding the Angevin, there's a legend that said they were descended from Satan's daughter Melusine, who had married an Angevin comte of a prior era, and she was revealed as a devil when she was made to witness the mass, flew out of a church window, and disappeared forever. But her fiendish blood would bubble up in the veins of her descendants. I actually don't think that makes much sense. In a way, no, just hear me out. I would say that sounds more like an ancestor of the Normands. Guillaume le Conquérant had nasty tendency that may tendencies for violence that makes Fulk le Noir look like a pleasant guy. Now, Fulk was known for being a rapist and a mass murderer, as I said. But Guillaume was even worse than that. And then you had Guillaume Rufus, who was not a pleasant guy either. You have, well, all of Henri II's sons. But the thing is, I would say it's not the Angevin blood that had some poison in it, or some devilry in it. If one was to say there was devilry in the blood, I would say it would be more than the blood of their Norman ancestors. As the line of Rolf, that is to say the ruling line of Normandy up until Jean stupidly lost the territories, is one that had a nasty tendency for having an ill temper. And contrary to what you might expect, Geoffroy did not have a bad temper. From what little I've read of him, it seems like he was actually generally more relaxed, charming, and well in control of himself. Mathilde could have a terrible temper. Now, she was the fiercer one of the two in a lot of ways. He was a battle-trained general, him. She was not. Well, she was a woman of the era. Woman didn't go out in battle. But she had an ill temper, and at one point when Etienne, well, she was made to swap Etienne, whom she had captured, in exchange for her brother, she decided that she would need a hostage still. So it was, because, a king for a duke is, or an earl, I should say, that's not a good deal. And the enemy substituted a peasant's son for Eustache, Etienne's son. The switch is made, and she, to the horror of contemporaries at the time, when she found out the truth, she had the boy killed just for spite anyways. And even men back then were going, why? That is such a spiteful, cruel thing to do. He's an innocent child. Well, the reason was she lost her temper. She had a mean temper. And later in life, she was to chill out and relax. But that temper of hers, I know I keep harping on about it, but she had that temper of the Plantagenets. I would argue that the Plantagenet dynasty did not take more after Geoffroy, but more after her. It's her temperaments, her ice-cold imperialist attitudes, her haughtiness, her snobbery, her short temper, her tendency for needless violence when it's not necessary, her desire to humiliate already defeated foes. These are all traits we see recur again and again and again in the Plantagenet dynasty. Her grandson, Jean, and Mame Richard, both of them would exhibit these traits. She could also be guilty of indecisiveness at times, something her son did not have, but her grandsons both had in spades at times. And yet, men admired her. She had a charisma about her, later in her life at least. And while they didn't like her at first, in her youth, because how could you? Later in life, when she chilled out, men admired her. And this is rather similar to the charm and charisma that Richard had, even though if you were to meet Richard, you'd go, what a psycho. Richard was not a likable fellow. I know there are those who are like, oh, well, he was such an icon of chivalry. No. If you were to introduce the concept of chivalry to Richard, which the concept wasn't yet fully formed, he'd probably be annoyed at the very idea because it puts limits on his behavior and his actions. And that's where Mathilde would also have the same attitude. Though she would like one thing about chivalry. You can't touch her because she's a woman. But the thing is, her descendants, such as Edward II, even Edward I, Edward III, even Henry V to an extent, would all exhibit traits that you can find and backdate to her. Now, I know people will say genetics do not influence personality or character traits. Arguably, yes, it kind of does. And the Plantagenet and even the Capet dynasty are full of examples of, in some cases, men who never met their father, and yet they become very similar. Like, for example, Henri III, Jean's son, Henry III, indecisive, ill-tempered, haughty, loved his finery, much like Mathilde, and even Jean, and was full of bluster. His dad died when he was about 8 or 9, but he became almost a mirror image, except with some key differences. He was very religious. Jean, I don't think, cared much about. Jean actually did have a religious side, not as obsessive in nature as Henry. Edward I has the exact same personality in some ways as Richard, his great uncle. And you have Edward II, exact same personality in a lot of ways as Henry III, even though the two never met. You have Edward III, the exact same personality as Edward I.
In fact, you could even backdate some of Edward III's behavior to William the Conqueror.
Yeah, actually, he does act a lot like Guillaume le Conquérant. So the Plantagenet line has a tendency of just always having the same personality traits all throughout their history. And up until the insane Richard III, who honestly committed dynastic suicide. But he arguably was showing a stronger penchant for the negative character traits of his line than had been previously shown earlier in the lineage. Whereas you look at, let's say, the Capet dynasty that was to be the rivals of the Plantagenet, Hugues Capet, a very capable, intelligent man who had a tendency to remember grudges, be very pious and whatnot, and was strong-willed and liked to dominate those around him. This all sounds rather like even Philippe Auguste. Philippe Auguste was, well, all the Capet could be at times humble, could be cold, haughty, domineering, pious, but they love to have control, and they love to have the law satisfy their need for control. Like, there had to be a legal reason. They were legal-minded. They were legalists. Like, okay, I control this bit of land. Well, it must be legally mine. Let's find a law or conjure up a law that says it's mine. Or, like, whatever detail. Everything had to be legally spelled out. And you need a constitution for it. You need all the legal details. The Plantagenet were not as legal-minded. They could be, but not always. Actually, the Plantagenet often found laws annoying because laws often meant, no, king, you can't do that. And so they'd get angry and throw temper tantrums, as Edward I did a few times when Parliament did not do what he wanted. Avec the Capetiens, to them it was, well, the law says you can't do this. Okay, how do I find a legal way around that? How do I draw as many funds as I want from this area of this chunk of land? Well, the law says you can't. But you see, there is a law for tithes that you can exploit because there's a tithe or a tax that's not been used in 200 years. Oh, so you've been holding out on me for those taxes, the king will then say to that area. Wait, what? In comes this law, this ancient law. So the Capet loved everything to be structured and organized and ordered. You have the Plantagenets who are chaos, you have the Capet who are order. And they had an icy temper, not a hot one. Now, what I just described is pretty much Hugues Capet. That sounds exactly like Philippe Auguste, sounds like Louis le Gros, sounds like even Philippe le Bel, Saint Louis. You see, Saint Louis, very pious, but very legal-minded, very strong on warriors, because there's a French saying, war and hunting were sport for the French kings, which it very much was. These are the heirs of Charlemagne, and they love to revel in Charlemagne's hobbies of war and hunting. and women. Oh boy, did the Capet love their women. So you've got these personality traits that are passed down, I would argue. The Angevins were a lot more easygoing to an extent, but they did have a penchant for some violence. And it would, rather than dilute the Norman blood, it would mix and enhance it for a very violent family that would arguably last till 1485. Thank heavens there was never a Plantagenet princess who married into the Capet family. That would have been a scary combo. But that said, you've got Mathilde, who, as said, would give birth to Henri II on the 5th of Mars, 1133, à Le Mans. The same place she was married, and the same place where she was to have oaths sworn to her. She now gave birth. Le Mans is very important. It was a very important frontier castle. So, on that note, we've concluded this blurb, and it's mentioned that in 1135 we would see, well, Henri le Premier would leave this world, and his grandson, who had not yet come of age, would find himself unable to defend his throne because he's 2 years old. So it would fall on Mathilde. And Mathilde would not take the usurpation of her crown very well. So, yeah. You've got the opening salvos of a war coming up. The opening salvos being the conflict between father and daughter over border castles. Border castles eventually surrendered, which opens the doorway for an invasion of Normandy. And you have the Norman lords stupidly forgetting about the fact that the back door is open, deciding to insult this legitimate heiress to their crown, and deciding to go with someone else over the legitimate heiress. And make no mistake, no matter what the arguments, and there are historians like Jim Bradbury who tend to go, Etienne had the right of it. He had no claim. One, he had an older brother. So essentially, you're arguing the middle brother has a better claim than the older brother. That makes no sense in medieval law. He usurped his older brother. You have a better argument to say Théobald had a claim than Etienne. As to Mathilde, while Parliament had not yet been invented, and we basically have to look at it as a witan, that is, or a witan, that is to say the Anglo-Saxon version of Parliament, they had been called forth, they had conferred, there had been debates. Yes, Henri said, you are doing this no matter what, and many men did not want to do it. Sure. But the reality is that legally, the crown of England and of Normandy goes to the next in line, well, the nearest relation to Henri le Premier. There are no male relatives in the direct line of Guillaume. You have to, here's the thing. Before you jump over to Etienne, who's claiming the crown through a female relative, wait, what? So that means you have to go to the female relatives of Guillaume Rufus, Robert Quatorze, and Henri le Premier. Oh wait, there's only one of them. That happens to be Mathilde. So the argument of Etienne, because, he's a male relative, claiming through a female relative. Aha. Yes, I know it sounds like they're stretching, but here's the weird thing. Most historians today, even with feminism and whatnot, have a rabid hatred of Mathilde. It's very weird. Arguably, the descendants of those who participated in this civil war basically won. And they did not have good memories of Mathilde. So they said she didn't have a claim. Actually, their ancestors swore oaths, and in medieval law, your oath is your bond. And this is the equivalent of the French-Canadian handshake agreement, which is basically, at least in French-speaking Canada, legally binding. Oaths are still a recourse legally. And even in some parts of Japan, if you make a handshake agreement, you are legally bound and you will be taken to court if you break that. And you may even be thrown in jail for breaking it. Now in Canada, English-speaking Canada, that's not the case. I've seen handshake agreements mean squat in English-speaking Canada. It has no legal bearing. But in French-speaking Canada, you go to Quebec and you break a handshake agreement, you better be damn well prepared for the consequences. So the thing is, handshake agreements are oaths. So you have that. You had a written agreement. Everyone signed it. Everybody affixed their seals. Everybody agreed Henri II, the grandson of Henri I, had the best claim. But the only way to get to him was through Mathilde. Now, the thing is, before you retrace the lineage to go to Etienne, you need to run out of possible heirs in the male line. You've not run out of male heirs. You have Mathilde. So the whole argument, Etienne has a claim. Well, who has a claim before him? Mathilde's son, Henri II. So Henri II has the best claim. But the problem is his mother has to come before him as either a regent or as a monarch. Henri I said monarch, basically legalizing the already existing Anglo-Saxon and Norman practice of cognative succession. So we have oaths, we have legal precedences dating back to the 10th century. We have all the ingredients for legal property, that is to say, England and Normandy, being passed down through the female line here. And the entire argument of Etienne stands on Mathilde having a better claim than him. So Etienne does not have a claim. Even if you were to humor it, the eldest son, the Comte de Blois, has to receive the crown, not Etienne. Etienne basically usurped two people. So the entire legal argument with him falls apart within 2 seconds. So this is something which, when you go to read a lot of textbooks, you're going to see historians either go rabid and over-feminist and over-favor Mathilde, unreasonably so to an extent because she was a terrible monarch. Etienne was also terrible, I'm not even going to lie. Or they go rabid for some reason, like Jim Bradbury. Now, Jim Bradbury can be a brilliant historian, but where Mathilde and Etienne are concerned, he becomes idiotic and over-favors Etienne and makes very stupid, asinine arguments against Mathilde. My argument is neither of them were worthy of the crown. They both sucked. But legally speaking, c'était elle. She had the claim. And arguably, I like Henri II. Henri II for the win. He's one of the greatest kings. I like him. So I'm going to favor that side. Not to mention, Etienne would prove himself indecisive, weak-willed, and would often give money to his enemies out of over-generosity, thinking, well, maybe if I'm nice to them, they'll eventually leave me alone. What? And, maybe if I abandon the north of England, the King of Scots won't keep taking territory. And when in reality, David can be compared to a hungry wolf who, once he had a bit of territory, what did he decide? I'm going to grab more. So this is a recipe for disaster. You have Mathilde, who has a temper and a passionate nature, and the Plantagenet tendency for being, no offense, a ravenous beast that'll destroy everything before her before she gives it up. And you have Etienne, who will give everything up if it means making friends. So, or at least he likes to buy his friends. And later he would end up paying off the mercenaries of Henri II when Henri II would invade the kingdom. Now unable to pay his mercenaries, who would turn on him, Henri II would apply to Etienne to help him pay off his mercenaries, which Etienne would do, laughing and thinking it was cute, thinking that this 14-year-old trying to wage war against him was cute, and send him back across Normandy with a few gifts and a bit of money. And then, but this was against the advice of some who said use him as a hostage, which that's what he should have done. Henri II would use this as a learning experience. He learned some soldiering there. When next he'd invade, he did so with a far more brutal efficiency, and basically backed Etienne into a corner so that he had to give up the crown almost. This is where, like I said, you just have a spineless weakling versus a brutal harpy. And honestly, it's the people who suffered. The saints truly slept in this era.
And looking at that description of Mathilde, part of me doesn't blame Geoffroy for not being too keen on her.
Well, yeah, she's a Plantagenet. Like, I know that he has the nickname and the surname Plantagenet, but let's be honest, she's the Plantagenet. I know historians want to say, no, all the character traits came from him. No. He did not have those character traits. Those negative character traits that became associated with every member of the family, from Henri II to Richard to Jean to Henri III to Edward, and Richard and Henry and Henry. Well, actually, one Henry didn't have too many of these traits, but Edward IV and Richard, even arguably Henry VIII, Mary, Elizabeth, arguably Mathilde had all those traits. So yeah, Geoffroy, I'm not keen on this marriage. She seems like a harpy. Yeah, I wouldn't want to marry her.
And that brings another detail as to why Mathilde would have the better claim. The entire matter of Anjou.
Yeah.
Because you want to create peace with Anjou. But if Etienne becomes king, where does that leave Anjou? Then
it leaves you with the old conflict and rivalry.
Yeah.
That's been there for about a century or two. But the whole idea is to tie the crown to that marriage so that you can just put an end to the darn rivalry. So this is a era of intricate policies and politics, and it's just, overall, you have a very, 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 very unpleasant time to be alive in. And yet it gave birth to one of the great seminal classics of our current era, Pillars of the Earth. So I guess some good came out of it. If about 900 and a half years later, well, nine and a half centuries, I should word it as that. But sorry about that slip up there. So yeah, this is not a fun time to be alive in. And I know I rambled a lot, but I'm hoping I'm giving a background and some context here to what happens. The trouble with the Plantagenet history book is that it basically glosses over a lot. I'm trying to offer a bit more detail, but it's off the top of my head. And I'm not trying to flex. I'm trying to basically do a book club without going into other books and sources. This is me not doing any Google searching and asking Dan for his opinion as he's reading this gloss over. And later, hopefully at some point down the road, we're going to do a more profound research by reading books that are a bit more detailed on the individual figures of these sort of eras. I do plan, however, before then to read Jim Bradbury's excellent Capet with Dan, so that we will then do the opposite dynasty, La Dynastie de la France. You know, greatest country in all of history. But anyways, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to smash that like, share this video or podcast or whatever, wherever you watch it, and subscribe, because we could definitely use more subs.